I'm always happy when people clap beforehand because you never know what's going to happen after. But good afternoon. This is going to be a very exciting lecture, and unlike the professors that I had in law school, I'll try to make it so that it does not put you to sleep. The concept, for the most part, is one that has not been widely embraced when you start talking to the military. I did spend 10 years as a judge advocate general in the Army, and often that was the reason I did not get promoted on a regular basis. But the point is that the command had to understand and embrace these things. And so bringing this to this group today is going to be an interesting experience. I hope you feel not encumbered in any way to ask questions that come to mind, nor in any way feel at restraint in terms of what we can talk about, because this is your meeting. This is your course. When we discuss the rule of law, we have to recognize that there is no one definition of the concept, just as there is no one definition of the concept of democracy. In Africa, there are both 54 states, each with their own legal traditions and history, but there's also supranational law, like the United Nations and the African Union, that have absorbed portions of the sovereignty from each of your countries and have brought them into a larger collective, which we know as international law. From each of these concepts, we also have to understand that this supranational absorption of sovereignty, which a lot of people take umbrage at, applies to everyone in the world community. I think when you look at the fact that this cession of authority to both continental organizations like the African Union and to the United Nations often operate in a global fashion to try and reinforce these standards for everyone equally in the world. So they operate within your domestic borders, and as in the case of Somalia or Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, it's a zone where we are always trying to adjust what those legal standards are and create new hybrids. This can be beneficial to the internal democracy, or they can be destructive of what people see as their right to self-determination in the long run. There are also 50 shades of gray, if you will, in between. And this is dramatized by places like the Central African Republic, like portions of the Eastern Congo, Darfur, and places like Abyei in Sudan, where these trusteeships, as in other places like the Western Sahara and Liberia, Somalia, Mali, and South Sudan, where the international community is trying to do capacity building, to build new institutions that are based on the will of the people in those particular zones. And based on the idea that people do want to rule themselves and to displace actors who are based on violence and have left people open to be preyed upon by predators. People who don't have any respect for the concept of law or the decency of humanity, regardless of how it is defined. So as you heard yesterday from the speakers, it's not just in this territorial realm, but there's also an evolving transnational realm which is growing, and we see the dimension of the rule of law as being something that's also creating new zones of interaction between our states, which puts a greater reliability upon you as the security sector leaders for your country. We are no longer divided into very clear zones of hegemons. We no longer have superpowers who can dictate to you, either the United States and Russia, as it was during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, I should say, during the Cold War, who tried to impose their standards and put up barriers of containment. Not just passports and international frontiers, but they had propiskas, they had identity cards, they had inviolate activity that as soon as you were identified as a person from outside, you could be prosecuted. So there's a new inward challenge that's taking place. We find this with the terrorist threat, They have gone and organized themselves as transnational organized criminal units, if you want to look at it from a civilian perspective. And it's causing governments to look more closely at what their powers are and what they can do in terms of invading personal privacy and the standards that people have about why we make decisions. Now we have governments inquiring as to the motivations as to why people are doing things. Before, it was very clear why people were operating. Now we have to begin to look at the words and the deeds of those who are out to destroy the state. So put greater credence on the dependents in the military and the security sector, people like yourselves, because you are the effective managers of the nation's territorial state, but you're also the stewards of state institutions and their reach into all parts of the nation. You are the guardians of the constitutional republic in each of your states, and you have to keep it secure, but keep it secure with justice. Justice delivered to the people and from the people. That's why during the discussions you heard yesterday, especially about ungoverned spaces, that these ungoverned spaces are a vacuum where there is no law, where lawlessness leads to the generation of children's armies. It leads to operational zones for mercenaries. It leads to the plundering of natural resources and the destruction of your legacy as a nation, the place that you're from. It brings about the human disasters that we have all heard about or know about, particularly on the continent when it comes to the plundering of the natural resources, the rape, the pillaging, the abuse of people. All of these things are nightmares for the rule of law. We saw the evacuation of a state regime in Libya, which led to the infusion of terrorists within that space. We saw the ineffective impact of the maritime space being controlled by navies suitable or Coast Guard suitable to keep the pirates out in the Indian Ocean. We're seeing it emerge in the Gulf of Guinea. We're seeing it emerge around the world. And in no way should you feel that in any way this is targeted at or specific to Africa. We witnessed these same things in the United States back in the 70s and the 80s when the drug cartels and transnational organized crime groups invaded the Caribbean and were pirating people's ships and taking them. Indonesia's dealt with it for years, as has most of South Asia. So it's something that when it emerged in the Indian Ocean and emerges now in the Gulf of Guinea, the world is saying we have to respond quicker. And it's not just in the oceans, in the maritime space. It's also in the Sahel and the vast stretches of the Sahara Desert. People that I've known in my family and my friends have said, how big is the Sahara Desert? I said, I remember flying my first time over the Sahara, and I had been up all day and I was very tired, and I fell asleep as I looked out the window and saw the vast stretches of the dunes in the sand. And I woke up hours later and I looked out and I went, oh my God, it's still there. It is so imposing in terms of its size, but this is a vast ungoverned space. It's a space where there are very small groups of individuals who are living and who are living in a very poverty-impacted zone. They lack water, they lack resources, they lack economic opportunity, they lack public administration in many places, and it's an ideal space for individuals to come and to create chaos. So there are structures in place that control our activities inside every organized democratic state. And the use of force, the power of coercion of the state, the most powerful thing that government can do, is a factor that makes you some of the most important actors in the process. Now, I'm going to, how do I do this? Is this it? Just this one? There you go. So, probably wondered who was up here talking. So the armed forces in mature African states are the most powerful arms of the government and serve as catalysts for change. People are looking at you. People are watching you in the government, what you do and how you react to what's taking place. You are principal agents of influence over the elites and the representatives that control governance, and you are role models to the people. You're role models to the people. When you look at the laws that are applicable to the security forces, you see, and I've listed most of them here, these are the things that need to govern the conduct of the security forces. The Declaration of Human Rights, the African Charter on People's Rights, the International Criminal Court Statute, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is still yet to be implemented. All of these things have been domesticated into your own indigenous laws. And the protocols that go along with them create obligations upon you as a security sector. So national laws on murder, genocide, crimes against humanity, all of these things are bolstered by the fact that they're also required under international law. And again, we are a very young republic in the United States. We are 225 years old. It's really not that old. And when you look at most of the countries in this room, the people who represent the countries in this room, often the regimes that you represent are less than a half a century old. So it's not much time. So this is not meant in any way to be critical. But what it comes down to is the fact that these governing legal institutions create obligations and duties upon you as members of the country. International jurisdiction, and the reason I put this up is the jurisdiction of all of these requirements for human dignity and human rights apply to every country in the world. This coloration shows the application of the International Criminal Court. The green countries are the ones that have signed on and are signatories. The reds did not sign on, and the yellows signed, but the application of the International Criminal Court is still pending because they have not been ratified. What is the meaning of the rule of law? Governments and its official agents and private entities are accountable. Everyone is accountable under the law in a society. There are no special ruling classes. There are a few kingdoms left in the world. There are a few places left in the world where the law does not apply, but that's generally not the case. Everyone is accountable under the law. And if they're not under their domestic law, then they are under international law. Laws have to be clear, publicized, stable, just, applied evenly to everyone in the society, and protect fundamental property rights, not just in the person, but in their property as well. And I think this is important as we've seen very important decisions come down across the continent in regard to tribal groups, ethnic groups, and having traditional lands that have been seized by governments for good reason in some cases not. We saw this in northern Nigeria when lands were sealed from a group, taken from a group that had lived there for 1,000 years. And so, well, we're going to do industrialization and mass agriculture in this zone, so we need the land of these traditional pastoralists. It wasn't in the law. It isn't acceptable under the law. It wasn't permitted under the Nigerian Constitution. It wasn't permitted, and the Supreme Court upheld the right of those individuals. So the processes by which laws are enacted, administered, and enforced are accessible, fair, and efficient. People have to have a way to get to the government. They have to be able to petition the government, petition the courts, petition their representatives so that they can bring their complaint, if you will, in a way that is other than violence. And it is our job, collectively as security officials, to make sure that these are there and that justice is delivered timely by competent, ethical, independent representatives who are neutral and who have the resources to carry out their job. So when you look at no person's above the law, everyone has to act in concert to establish values. There are sanctions, and this is no person above the law. This was what we had in the situation in Egypt with Mr. Mubarak, who thought he was separate and apart from the law. Bashir in Sudan thought that because there was not going to be an investigation of his conduct dealing with the militias in Darfur, that he was going to be exempt from the law, and that was not the case, and it is not the case. When you look at individuals like Gbagbo in Cote d'Ivoire, who thought even though the election didn't come out right, well, I'm the president of the republic, I'm going to assert my values. That didn't turn out well for him. And it's not going to turn out well for people like Mr. Mugabe either, even though he has had the last election certified by his electoral commission. He is an individual who's had grave breaches of international law. So the laws have to be defined by the people acting in concert with values. There have to be sanctions and rewards for adherence to legal requirements. This is the great legacy of Nelson Mandela. Here was an individual who allowed the apartheid racist regime in South Africa to go forward until their own internal values collapsed, until the international community made them a pariah. The United Nations, in concert with just about everyone's representatives in this room, declared apartheid a crime against humanity, and he waited and was abiding by the law, knowing that the reward was going to come for an independent South Africa. Now that may be for many of us a very difficult thing to take, but the point is, it's the way that he established a tradition and was acceptable to the South African people and continues to be why it is a great nation and he is a great leader. So there's also has to be recourse for punishment for those who do not obey the law. And we saw this with the individuals who were brought before the International Criminal Court from the Central African region, the Lord's Resistance Army. We saw this for individuals who've been brought before the international courts in the Balkans, from Serbia, from Kosovo, from other places, brought to the court, and justice will be served. There are today 139 indictments that are outstanding in the International Criminal Court. There's great criticism because the preponderance of the people who have been brought to the court for trial are African right now. But that doesn't mean that the others can escape that kind of justice. Those 139 indictments will be investigated at some point, each one of them, and those other individuals around the world, whether it's Taiwan, Korea, North Korea, will be brought to justice in the same way. If at all, it is a fair system. So the citizenry has to have this, and they have to understand that the law is equal for everyone and is guidance to all. The law also has to be transparent. The parliamentary organizations in each of your country, the legislative chambers have to make laws that are just and binding, clear and open to new solutions to problems. And we're seeing a lot of creativity. We've seen creativity coming out of Ghana and Nigeria and a number of other countries, Mozambique, where we're seeing new approaches taken to solving old problems. And the laws are prospective. They can only go forward and applied evenly to all groups. And this is one that's this second to last, human rights standards. I think the human rights standards, as much as we all presume we know what they are, that there is a new push on for people to both codify and bring it into the constitutions of the respective countries that are going through transition right now. And again, our job, your job, as a member of the security sector is to reinforce what those duties are under the law. Duty, honor, national reputation, all of these things are important. And that persons and their property are protected from arbitrary oppression and seizure. Now, the parliamentary zone, for example, very interesting, the Angola Supreme Court in the last elections came in and said the person who was in charge of the Electoral Commission was biased in favor of the ruling party, had been appointed by the president, was an individual who came from that same political party, and was someone who had clear predisposition on what they were going to do in terms of the election. The Supreme Court removed, said, no, this isn't going to happen. You have to have the law being followed by having independent and impartial people who are involved. Equality. Again, everyone under the law needs to be given the same treatment regardless of their race, ethnicity, or creed. There was a big question the last time I was in Tanzania. They were talking about how there was going to be differential justice for people because there was a belief among the people in some areas of the country that albinos were not full citizens or human beings in those countries. So you had individuals, parents, families, individuals and tribes who thought we don't have to give them the dignity of a human being. And they were murdering children and murdering albinos. And the Tanzanians came back and said, no, not only is this going to be a huge push on our part to make sure everyone understands that this myth that has existed for hundreds of years is no longer applicable, but we're going to go special after individuals who breach this. So the laws have to be fairly enacted. They have to be administered fairly, understood at face value. The law and derivative regulations are efficient to the purposes and goals they seek to attain. In the last elections in Kenya, there was a great fear that there would be again a political eruption over what was going to take place among the various ethnic groups which had followed previous elections. And the Supreme Constitutional Court came through and said, we will examine the election results, the procedures, the parties. We will look at what has taken place to make sure it's procedurally correct. Most people thought they would just deny the case, that they weren't going to look at it. But they examined the case, they came up with a conclusion, and violence was averted because people believed that the law was going to work. Burkina Faso had a problem after the assassination of Thomas Sankara in 1987. There was a great demand to find out what happened to Sankara. Who were the perpetrators? Why were they being covered up? What was taking place? The courts refused, the prosecutors refused, and as a result, Burkina suffered for many years because of the idea that they were not going to pursue these kinds of cases. Has to be neutral and timely. Sierra Leone, the trials and convictions of the AFRC and the RUF in terms of individuals who had been involved in war crimes in that particular country, delivered timely and competently by legal processes and by judges who believed in what the outcome should be. So again, this is very brief, and I want to point out that it's important for security sector officials because it establishes the confidence of civilians that the security sector is subordinate to civilian authorities. It also gives you the thing that I think was one of the leading themes coming into this discussion over the next couple of weeks, which is how do you bring development to your respective countries and to the continent. And the point is that you know and I know that it's not just here. I mean, I'm from Detroit, okay? And we're going through bankruptcy. We're looking for new direct investment in our city. You're looking for it in your respective countries. But there has to be international acceptance that the standards, the laws, the rules, and the conditions that people find in those particular places are going to be at a particular level. And these basic levels are very important in terms of establishing the confidence in the rest of the world as to why they should invest their money, their time, their foreign aid. And in Detroit, it's the same thing. And it also facilitates security sector reform. There are imbalances that have existed in the continent for a very long time within the security forces. If they're going to reform, not just because of international standards, but as a rational way for your own internal expenditures inside the country to be used in a way to benefit for the citizens, you have to go through this process, and the best way, the only way to do it is through the rule of law. And whole of government approaches, because the rule of law, as I'm sure Dr. Dempsey has pointed out to you at the beginning in his various lectures, covers the whole spectrum. We can't just talk about having parliaments that are enacting fair laws or good laws. We have to make sure that the election processes, through the filing of nominations, to the conduct of elections, to the counting of the ballots, to the procedures inside those legislative assemblies, are fair. And when those laws are passed, that they're going to be followed by the executive. And the persons who are effectuating those laws and the individuals who are prosecuting those who violate those laws are going to be meaningful in terms of how they take on their responsibilities and their duties. And if there are convictions, there should be a correctional system, one that excludes these individuals from the rest of society, but also corrects the problem and corrects those individuals and rehabilitates those individuals and brings them back into society. So there's a whole spectrum that involves all of these activities which are best suited to rule of law applications and which bring the whole realm of government into a range of being accountable. There are some differences that you've had in terms of Africa. There are the artificial boundaries that were set and forced by the colonials, by the legacy inheritance of autocratic political institutions. In other words, from the top down, in some states around the world, what you find is places where the government grew from the bottom up. But in Africa, for most part, these colonial regimes instituted top-down regimes. They created arrangements within the country where there is suppression of indigenous groups. And the biggest, I think, negative legacy is the idea that it's a winner-take-all process. The winner-take-all process is very destructive of building democratic societies. I was a state senator for 16 years in Michigan. When I came in as a Democrat, we were in charge of both houses. We thought we had all the authority, all the power. I was going to dictate to those Republicans what they were going to do, and that's the way it was. Of course, at 27, you think you know everything. When we fell into the minority, all of a sudden, and the Republican majority came into being, and they're telling you, this is the way it's going to be, Kelly, and this is what you're going to do. I was going, no. Can't we be friends? So beyond the expediency, what we learned was I learned a role as a constructive opponent, a role as an individual who could work with others in the party, and that we could get away from winner take all. And how could we make good policy by everyone working together? So when you look at the fact of the institutions you represent, you see that there is high degree of respect among the population. And the thing that you have to understand is you are the only individuals who control that coercive capacity of the state. But there's a new democratic tradition growing up in each of the countries in this room, and in each of the countries around the world, and actually in this country as well. And I think what that does is it's coming back to the idea that there is a place at the table for everyone. And the old definitions of what took place in the Cold War that governed your countries up until 20 years ago, that you had to have a powerful leader, that you did not really have to fully respect the legislative chambers, all of that's going away. All of that's, in my expectation, is going to be gone. So when you look at why we're having this discussion, I think Dr. Opunde will bolster this. I had a look at his presentation. It's the same thing. It's that there's a direct linkage between what the security sector does and performs and the empowerment of the community. And it's essential for you to realize, as the United Nations General Assembly states in this statement, it's essential for the realization of sustained economic growth, sustainable development, and the eradication of poverty, which is all of our goals, roles, and objectives. And working together, we can make this happen, because rule of law impacts security, it minimizes social conflict, it stops groups from being able to exploit you and exploit the cleavages between different organizations. It is an implied check on executive powers. It insulates the military from overzealous civilian oversight, and it gives the assurance to others that there are going to be independent branches of power in the legislative, the executive, and the judicial that the military is aware of and participates in and can reinforce and is accountable. And when you look at what this is, and I won't go over these all again because I think I just did, foundations of legal state, the biggest thing is that when you look at what the legal process produces, laws initiated by the representatives of the people, and that's the idea. You can't have all the 12 million or 30 million, or in this case of this country, 300 million people trying to all make the laws and all to articulate the laws at the same time. We elect representatives. Representatives have to be respected, and there has to be a procedure that we know they're going to act by, which is going to be followed. That they have to do everything prospective in its effect, and that they can't do ex post facto laws. And the most important thing is judicial review. Now again, this is controversial because in many countries you don't have the great independence in judiciaries, but they're moving more and more in that direction. And I think the law schools that are training the judges, the magistrates, and the individuals in the practice of law all recognize that they have additional responsibilities just beyond getting a paycheck or holding a post and a job. And it keeps checks on the executive branch. It keeps checks in terms of what they can do. It makes sure that the executive branch and the working as the law enforcement arm is operating within judicial constraints, and judicial review is available, and that even the judges are operating within the constitutional foundation for what they do, and they must be independent, they must have integrity and acceptance, and they must make laws that have prospective, they must make decisions that have the effect of law, that have prospective impact as well. I'll leave you with this statement from Lord Petty Ashdown, and that is the fact that what we need to have in every country around the world is the establishment and respect for the rule of law first. Because a functioning economy, a free and fair political system, the development of civil society, public confidence in society, all results from rule of law. Leaders' way forward. Specifically for this group, educate yourself as to what constitutes your obligations, educate your subordinates and your peers, create a sense of understanding among your family, among the people from your town, from your village, from the place that you come, your neighborhood. Organizational awareness and sensitivity that rule of law prevails. And, as of course I have to put a pitch in because I have a law degree too, seek out your lawyers. Seek out your professors. Seek out the people who can help you in understanding the concepts if it isn't clear. And make all of the broader systemic reforms within your society consistent with the rule of law, and we will all live in a better world. Thank you very much. At least I didn't put you to sleep.